It all started with the whispers, you know? The kind that feels like someone's right behind you. But when you turn around, no one's there. It's that chilling sensation, a tingle down your spine, the hairs on the back of your neck standing up as you instinctively glance over your shoulder. Most of the time, it's easy to dismiss it as your imagination. But sometimes, in places like Hollow Creek, that feeling sticks with you, and no matter how hard you try to shake it, it lingers. For years, people in Indiana have talked about an old abandoned farmhouse deep in Hollow Creek. It's the kind of place you drive past in the dead of night and feel a chill run through you, even if you didn't see anything. The kind of place that, when people mention it, you feel like you should avoid, but you can't help being drawn to it anyway. It's the whispers that start it all. You hear them before you even see the house. People say it's haunted, but no one really knows why. Some say it's cursed, while others swear it's the spirits of the family who once lived there. Their souls trapped, unable to find peace after a brutal, tragic event. When I first heard about it, I didn't think much of it. A lot of people love to talk about haunted places, right? There's always someone claiming they've seen a ghost or heard strange noises, and it's easy to brush those stories off as nothing more than imagination running wild. But after hearing the stories more and more, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Hollow Creek, and especially the farmhouse. At first, I thought it was just local superstition. People around here love a good ghost story, especially one with a mysterious past. They love to talk about the dark history of places like this farmhouse, as if by speaking of it, they're somehow in control of it. But the more I heard, the more I realized that these weren't just rumors. The whispers weren't just ghost stories told around a campfire or over drinks at the local bar. No, these whispers were different. People who had never met before told similar stories, described the same things. It was unsettling. The farmhouse had always been there, but it had never really been the subject of much attention. That all changed after a few people, mostly thrill seekers or ghost hunters, ventured into the property in search of answers. I had heard whispers myself, but it wasn't till I met a few of these people who had actually been inside the farmhouse, that I realized something wasn't right. They spoke about hearing voices, strange murmurs that seemed to come from the walls. These weren't the voices of living people. They were too faint, too distant. It was almost like someone was trying to speak to them, but they were too far away to be understood. And they said the house itself seemed to breathe, like it was alive. One woman I met, who had gone there with her friends, told me about her experience. She said they walked into the farmhouse with nothing but flashlights and their curiosity. But the moment they stepped inside, The air felt different. Heavy, thick, like something was pressing down on them. At first, it seemed like a typical abandoned house, with peeling wallpaper and rotting floorboards. But as they ventured deeper into the house, the whispers started. She said they weren't voices, just faint murmurs, like the wind blowing through cracks in the walls. But the deeper they went into the house, the louder it got. It wasn't until they reached the old staircase that things really started to get strange. She said the whispers grew stronger, more distinct. At first, she thought she heard her name. Then she thought it was just her imagination. But then the whispers began to form words. Slow, deliberate words. Get out. Don't stay. And finally, they bolted out of the house, leaving their equipment behind. But then I started hearing similar stories. Another man, a local, claimed that he had been walking near the farmhouse one night when he heard the whispers too. But when he turned around, there was nothing there. No one. Just the wind and the sound of rustling leaves. But that feeling stayed with him. The feeling of someone being right behind him, breathing down his neck. And the worst part, the whispers didn't stop when he left. They followed him home. By this point, I was getting curious, though not quite ready to believe it. After all, these could all be coincidences, stories passed down from one person to the next. But then, I learned about the history of the farmhouse, and things started to make more sense. At least, in a terrifying, chilling way. The farmhouse wasn't always abandoned. Once, it was a home, a family's home. The kind of home where kids ran through the yard and dinner was served around a warm kitchen table. But that all changed one cold, fateful night. The family that lived there was murdered. No one knew exactly what happened or who did it, but the house was left empty. A crime scene, frozen in time. Bloodstains on the floor, furniture scattered, but no answers. The local authorities investigated, but the case went cold. The house stayed empty, abandoned, a place to be avoided. But the whispers, they didn't stop. They grew, spreading like wildfire through the small town. Soon, no one would go near the place. The farmhouse became a symbol of fear, a place where no one dared to enter. People started saying that the spirits of the murdered family still lingered there, trapped in a world between the living and the dead, unable to move on. And that's when the whispers started. I wish I could say that I wasn't affected by these stories, that I didn't believe a word of it. But after hearing everything, after hearing the fear in the voices of the people who had been there, after hearing the stories about the whispers and the dark past of the house, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong with that farmhouse, and no matter how much I tried to push it out of my mind, I can't. They were out there, in Hollow Creek, calling to anyone who was brave or foolish enough to listen. And I had to know what it was that kept people coming back. What was it about this farmhouse that drew people in, only to leave them scared, desperate to forget what they had seen? There's no turning back now. The whispers are real, and they're coming from the abandoned farmhouse. And who knows, maybe one day I'll be the one who hears them too.
So, here's where things get creepy. The history behind the farmhouse is dark. Really dark. If you're ever in Hollow Creek, you might hear whispers about the place. But very few people know the full story. Years ago, back in the 1800s, the house was home to a family. A nice, peaceful family. Or at least, that's what people thought. Neighbors would say they were just an ordinary family, with a husband and wife, 2 kids, and a dog. They lived simply, minding their own business. They weren't wealthy or well-known, just one of many rural families trying to make a life for themselves in the wilderness of Indiana. But everything changed one night. That night, something terrible happened. A massacre. It was a night like any other, or so it seemed. There was no sign that anything was amiss when the sun set and the family went to bed. But by the time the neighbors woke up, something had gone horribly wrong. They didn't hear the screams until it was too late. By the time anyone got close enough to the farmhouse, the doors were locked and the windows were shut tight. But there were noises, a chilling, haunting sound, almost like the wail of someone in pain, echoing through the night. They tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just the wind or the night animals. But it didn't stop. The screams, they say, came in waves, first faint, then louder, and more desperate. And then, nothing. The silence was deafening. When the neighbors finally forced their way inside, it was too late. The whole family had been slaughtered. The sight that greeted them was beyond anything they could have imagined. Blood was everywhere. It coated the floors, splattered across the walls. It was as if the entire house had been drenched in it. But the most horrifying part wasn't the blood. It was the way the family had been left. The mother and father lay together in the living room, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, their eyes wide open in terror. The children were found upstairs, their faces frozen in expressions of fear, as though they had known something horrible was coming. Their dog, usually loyal and protective, was also found dead in the yard. No one could understand how something so brutal could happen in such a quiet, peaceful part of the world.
There were no signs of forced entry. The house had been locked tight. The doors, the windows, everything had been secured from the inside. It was like the family had been trapped in their own home with nowhere to run. And there was no evidence left behind to tell who had done it. No footprints, no fingerprints, no weapons, nothing. Just the bodies, cold and lifeless, left to tell the story of something unspeakable. As you might imagine, the news spread fast. Word of the massacre spread through Hollow Creek like wildfire. Neighbors were terrified, and no one knew what to believe. Some of the locals said it was the work of a stranger passing through the area, someone who had a grudge against the family. Others whispered that the father had snapped, that he had killed his family in a fit of rage before taking his own life. But there was no proof. No one knew what had happened. No one knew why it had happened. The investigation was a mess. No one could make sense of it. The authorities tried to figure it out, but the case went cold. The farmhouse, once a home, became nothing more than a crime scene. As the years passed, the house fell into disrepair. No one dared to live there again. The land around it became overgrown with weeds and vines, as if nature itself was trying to swallow the place whole. The house slowly decayed, the roof caving in, the walls crumbling, but still no one came to claim it. No one wanted to live there. The whispers began to spread even further. Some said the house was cursed. Others said it was the spirits of the murdered family trapped in the house, unable to move on. People who had lived nearby started to avoid the area altogether. The farmhouse became a symbol of fear, a reminder of something terrible that no one could explain. And as the years went by, the house only grew darker. It wasn't long before the stories began to take on a life of their own. People started to claim they had heard strange noises coming from the house. Whispers in the night, the sound of footsteps on the stairs, and even voices calling out from the windows. Others swore they had seen lights flickering in the windows at night, even though the house had been abandoned for years. Some even claimed to have seen figures moving behind the curtains, their faces hidden as if watching from within. But when anyone went near the house to investigate, they found nothing. The place was always empty. But the worst part was the feeling. People who ventured too close to the farmhouse often spoke about the feeling that something was watching them, something that didn't want them there. The air around the house felt different, heavier, like a weight pressing down on your chest. And that's what kept people away. That sensation, the feeling that something was lurking inside the decaying walls, waiting for anyone brave enough to enter. And so, For decades, the farmhouse sat there, a decaying relic of a horrible event. The stories about it continued to spread, and the whispers grew louder. People who didn't live in Hollow Creek still knew about it, still feared it. And yet, no one ever went inside again. It was a place that seemed to exist outside of time, a place where the past never really ended. The massacre was long over, but the house remained, frozen in that one horrifying night. The farmhouse was eventually swallowed by the landscape, the surrounding trees and bushes creeping in closer and closer. It became just another abandoned building in the middle of nowhere, forgotten by most. But those who remembered, those who had heard the stories, still avoided it. No one knew for sure what had happened that night, and no one wanted to find out. They say that the house still stands today, hidden deep within the overgrown trees, a silent reminder of the horrors that happened there. But the whispers, they never stopped. They still linger, waiting for the next person to hear them. And no one knows just how deep the darkness really goes in Hollow Creek. Because some things, once they happen, can never truly be forgotten. When people started moving back into the area, that's when the weird things began. For years, Hollow Creek had been a quiet, forgotten part of Indiana. The town had its usual share of people, farmers, traders, the occasional passerby. But after the massacre, the place fell into a silence that felt too deep, too heavy. The old farmhouse sat there, rotting away, its presence still as imposing as it had been when the family was alive. But as time passed and new families began to settle in, the silence began to crack. It started with small things, things that could easily be brushed off as nothing more than the house settling or the wind playing tricks. At first, it was just a door creaking in the dead of night, the kind of sound you might hear in any old house. A window slamming shut when there was no breeze. An odd noise here and there, faint but unsettling. People who lived nearby thought little of it at first. Maybe it was just the old house, its wooden frame and rusty hinges giving in to the weight of time. They didn't think much of the strange sounds, just chalked it up to the house being old, like any other abandoned building. But then the whispers started. They were faint at first, little more than a breath of sound, just enough to make people turn their heads, to make them question what they had heard. The first time someone noticed it was an older woman who lived on the outskirts of the neighborhood. She'd been sitting on her porch, enjoying the cool evening air, when she heard something. It was faint, distant, but there was no mistaking it. A voice. No, more like voices. She couldn't make out the words at first, but she knew they weren't coming from anywhere near her. It wasn't the wind or the rustling of the trees. It was coming from the direction of the farmhouse. At first, she tried to ignore it. People talk and stories spread. It was probably just her imagination. she thought. But when it happened again, she couldn't deny it. The voices, they were muffled. Too far to understand, but they were there. And the more she listened, the clearer they became. They weren't just random sounds. They were calling out. She couldn't make out the words, but there was something in the tone, something desperate. It was as if someone or something was trying to reach out to her. The next day, she went to the local diner where the townspeople gathered for coffee and conversation. She hesitated before speaking up, unsure if anyone would believe her. But to her surprise, people nodded. Some even seemed to know exactly what she was talking about. Others had heard it too. They'd heard the whispers, just like she had. Some had even sworn that they'd heard the voices of the family that had died in the massacre, calling out, asking for help, their voices full of sorrow and pain. But it wasn't just a few strange occurrences. Over time, more people reported hearing the whispers too. Different people from different parts of town, all describing the same thing, soft voices calling out from the direction of the farmhouse. Soon, people started hearing more than just whispers. They began to hear the distinct sound of footsteps pacing in the old house. At first, it was just one person. Then, another. Then entire families, all hearing the same thing. Someone walking inside the farmhouse. Even though the place had been abandoned for decades. It was like the house had come alive again, like something had woken up inside it. The footsteps always seemed to come from the upstairs, where the family's children had once slept. But there was never anyone there. The house remained empty, and the whispers only grew louder. And then came the nightmares. People living nearby started reporting vivid dreams. Dreams so real, so terrifying, that they felt like they had lived through them. In these dreams, the family that had died in the massacre was trapped. They were screaming, begging for help, but no one could reach them. The house was burning, the flames licking at the walls, but the family couldn't escape. Their faces twisted in agony as they tried to get out. But the fire was too strong. The screams echoed in the night, their voices growing fainter as the fire consumed everything around them. And just when the flames seemed to swallow them whole, the dream would end. But the feeling would linger long after they woke up, an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they were still trapped in that house with the family, still suffocating in the smoke. Some even said they woke up to find themselves with scratches and bruises, marks that they couldn't explain. At first, it was just one or two people. But as more and more people began to share their experiences, it became clear that something was happening. Some said they had woken up with strange marks on their arms and legs, like they had been dragged across the floor while they slept. Others claimed they had woken up to find their sheets torn, as if someone had been pulling at them during the night. Some even said they had found the marks on their necks, bruises that looked like fingers had wrapped around them in the dark. The stories kept coming, and as the months went by, the whispers continued. They were no longer just strange sounds or faint murmurs. They were something more, something that no one could explain. People started to avoid the area altogether, keeping their distance from the farmhouse. The fear that had settled into the town was palpable. It was as if everyone knew the house was dangerous, that something had been unleashed there. The house that had once been a home was now a place of terror, its dark history coming to life again. And it wasn't just the sounds or the nightmares that scared people. It was the feeling, the oppressive, heavy feeling that seemed to hang in the air whenever anyone got too close to the farmhouse. It was like the house itself was watching, waiting, and anyone who ventured too near could feel it. It was as if the very ground around the house was cursed, and the whispers would follow anyone who dared to get too close. The closer you got to the house, the stronger the feeling became, like something was tugging at you, pulling you toward the door. But no matter how much you wanted to run, you couldn't. The house seemed to hold you there, frozen in place, unable to escape. The whispers didn't just stay in the house. People who lived far from the farmhouse, people who had never even been near it, began hearing them. They'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of soft voices in their ears, voices they couldn't understand. Sometimes they'd hear the whispers in their dreams. Other times, they'd hear them when they were awake. It was like the house had spread its curse, reaching out to anyone who dared to listen. It wasn't long before the town was consumed by fear. No one knew who to turn to. No one knew how to stop it. The whispers were everywhere, and they were only getting louder. Some people tried to leave, to escape the town, but the whispers followed them. And those who stayed, well, they were too afraid to speak up, too afraid to ask for help, too afraid to even acknowledge what was happening. The farmhouse had become a symbol of something far darker than anyone could have imagined. It was no longer just a building. It was a place of horror, a place where the past and the present had collided, where the whispers of the dead could still be heard, calling out for help that would never come. And as the whispers grew louder, the town of Hollow Creek began to realize that the house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And it wasn't about to let anyone leave without hearing its story. As you'd expect, some people got curious. It's in human nature, isn't it? When you hear stories about a place, like the old farmhouse in Hollow Creek, your imagination starts running wild. You want to know if the legends are real, if the ghosts and whispers are truly there, or if it's all just a story to scare people off. After all, the farmhouse had been standing for decades, decaying slowly, but never completely gone. People avoided it, of course. The house had a bad reputation, a dark history that made the bravest souls think twice. But for a group of teenagers, it was more than just an old house with a reputation. It was a challenge. They were tired of hearing stories and rumors. They wanted to see for themselves if the whispers were real. They wanted to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. So one night, they made a pact. The group, 3 boys and 2 girls, made their way to the farmhouse. A dare. A simple bet between friends. A foolish thing to do, as they'd come to realize. The wind whispered through the trees. But it wasn't enough to stop them. They approached the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, the old structure looming in front of them like a giant that had been asleep for years. The place looked even worse. The door creaked as they pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and age. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they walked, and the faint smell of something far worse lingered in the background. But they couldn't quite place it. They explored the house, their flashlights dancing on the cracked walls and faded wallpaper. But even as they laughed and joked, something wasn't right. The air felt thick, charged with something they couldn't understand. The house seemed to be watching them, like it was alive, its every creak and groan a warning that they were trespassing on something they didn't fully understand. Hours passed, and the unease grew every time they looked toward the staircase leading to the second floor. It felt like something was there, watching them from above. A shadow, a movement. It was hard to say. It could have been their imagination playing tricks on them. But with every minute that passed, the house seemed to close in on them, its dark presence suffocating. The whispers, barely audible at first, started to emerge from the walls. It was as though they had always been there, waiting for the right moment. Faint at first, like the rustling of paper, or the wind slipping through cracks. But gradually, they became clearer. The voices weren't of the family anymore, at least not in the way the rumors. As the night wore on, the whispers began to grow louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to reach out to them. It wasn't just the house making the noises anymore.
It was the walls, the floor, the air itself seemed to pulse with the voices. The deeper they ventured into the house, the more intense the whispers became. And then the sounds of footsteps, heavy, slow footsteps that echoed in the silence. The teens froze, their hearts pounding. There was no way it could be someone else, right? No one else had dared to come near the place for years. The footsteps came from above, from the attic. That was when they decided to split up. It was foolish. But fear and adrenaline often make you do things you wouldn't normally do. One of the boys, Mark, led the way upstairs. His flashlight beam wavered as he ascended the creaky stairs. His friends followed hesitantly, but the house felt colder with every step. They reached the landing, and the air felt thicker, like it had substance. The whispers were louder now, more urgent, more pressing. And then they reached the attic door. It was cracked open, just slightly, like it had been waiting for them. Without thinking, they pushed it open. The attic was smaller than they'd imagined, filled with old furniture, broken mirrors, and cobwebs thick enough to make you feel like you were walking through a haunted graveyard. But there, in the center of the room, something caught their eye. At first, it seemed like a shadow, but as their flashlights scanned the room, they saw it. The walls were covered with strange symbols. Not just random markings, but symbols that looked ancient, like they had been drawn in blood. It was impossible to make sense of them. Some of the marks looked familiar, like they came from old religious texts, but others were foreign, alien. They couldn't place them. It was like the house itself was speaking through the walls, warning them to leave. And that's when the smell hit them. It wasn't the familiar stench of decay. It was something worse. The unmistakable, sickening smell of death. It permeated the air, thick and oppressive. The floor seemed to pulse beneath their feet, as if the house itself was breathing. The group stood there for a moment, frozen in fear, unsure of what to do next. And then they heard it again, the whispers. But this time, they weren't coming from the walls. No, this time they were coming from the dark corner of the room, where shadows pooled like oil. The whispers weren't soft anymore. They were clear, distinct. Leave now, you shouldn't be here. The words were cold, sharp, as if they had been spoken by something older than time itself. It was as if the house knew their every fear, every doubt. And then, one by one, the lights flickered out. They tried to run, but the door slammed shut. The cold air grew thicker, and the room seemed to twist and warp around them. Their flashlights flickered, barely working now, casting weak beams across the room, showing only more symbols, more dark shapes. But it was too late. The house had them. The whispers grew louder,
almost deafening as the walls seemed to close in. And in that moment, everything went dark. The next morning, their friends went looking. At first, they didn't think much of it. They thought it was just another prank, that the group was hiding somewhere, laughing at them for being so worried. But when they arrived at the farmhouse, the sight they saw sent a chill down their spines. The yard was littered with their belongings, clothes, shoes, and even their phones, all scattered haphazardly, as if they had been dropped in a hurry. But there was no sign of the group, no trace of where they had gone. They looked inside the house, calling their names, but no answer came. It was silent, too silent. And then, just as they were about to leave, they heard it. Just the symbols on the walls, and the whispers. More urgent now, more desperate. But the house didn't let them leave either. They felt it, the presence, watching, waiting. And for the first time, they understood. A few weeks later, the group of friends, now terrified and shaken, decided they had to put an end to the nightmare. They were no longer the same carefree teenagers who had laughed off the warnings and ventured into the farmhouse with nothing but their curiosity. No, they had seen too much, heard too much. The whispers, the strange symbols, the feeling that the house was alive. It all had a weight that pressed down on them, a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. They couldn't ignore it anymore. Something needed to be done. They knew they had to return to the house, but this time, they wouldn't go alone. The terror they'd experienced was beyond what any of them could handle. So they did what anyone would do when faced with something they couldn't explain. They turned to someone who was supposed to have the answers. Someone who could help them confront the evil that had taken root in the farmhouse. They found a priest, a man of faith, someone who could cleanse the house, drive out whatever dark force had taken control. It seemed like the only way to stop the nightmares, the whispers, the growing sense of dread that had followed them since their first encounter. The night was cold when they arrived. They had a plan. The priest, prepared with his Bible and holy water, led the group up the path to the farmhouse. Each of them could feel the weight of the air pressing against them, thick and suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for them. The trees around the house stood like silent sentinels, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers, reaching toward the sky. The house was still the same, its dilapidated form looming before them, an imposing silhouette in the moonlight. The windows, dark and empty, seemed to watch them as they approached. There was no sign of movement, no strange noise, yet they couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them inside.
The priest murmured a prayer under his breath as they entered, his steps measured and confident. But even he couldn't hide the unease in his voice. The priest clutched his cross tightly, his knuckles turning white as he led the group into the heart of the house. They moved through the rooms, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The house creaked and groaned, as if it were waking up from a long slumber. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy that was hard to ignore. But they pressed on, following the priest, determined to face whatever waited for them. They made their way up the stairs, their flashlights flickering, casting long shadows on the walls. The whispers grew louder as they ascended, the sound now clearly distinguishable, though still just out of reach. There was something unnerving about them, something so familiar, yet impossible to place.
And then, just as they reached the top of the stairs, the whispers changed. The soft murmur of voices turned into something far worse. The air grew thick, and the temperature dropped, sending shivers down their spines. It was then that the first scream rang out, sharp and desperate. It wasn't the kind of scream you'd expect from someone in danger, the kind that might slip out in a moment of fear. No, this scream was different. It was full of agony, full of terror, but it wasn't coming from the house itself. It was coming from one of them, from the group.
The priest turned toward the sound, his face pale, his mouth moving in a silent prayer. And then, in a horrifying instant, the whispers turned into screams. But these weren't the screams of the family. No, they were the screams of the group itself. The friends, the people who had once been so brave, were now at the mercy of whatever evil lurked inside the house. One by one, they were pulled toward the attic. It started with the youngest of the group, a girl named Emily. She screamed, her voice rising in pitch as an unseen force dragged her backward, up the stairs, toward the attic. She tried to fight it, tried to scream for help, but her body was no longer her own. The invisible hands gripped her tightly, pulling her up the stairs with horrifying strength. The others tried to stop it, to grab hold of her, but it was as if their hands slipped right through her, like she was nothing more than a wisp of smoke. Then, just as quickly, the next friend was pulled toward the attic. The same force, the same invisible hands, dragged him away from the group. It was chaos. Panic filled the air as each person was taken, one by one. They cried out for help, their voices blending together in a horrifying symphony of fear, but no one could save them. The priest, holding onto his cross, tried to perform an exorcism, but it was no use. The words that had once held power seemed to falter, his voice growing weaker with each failed attempt. He couldn't fight this. Whatever had taken hold of the house was stronger than anything he had ever encountered. The darkness had taken control, and there was no going back. The air in the house thickened, heavy with an oppressive presence. It was as if the house itself was alive, feeding off their fear. The shadows that had once been mere shapes now seemed to move, shifting and stretching in unnatural ways. The walls, once cracked and broken, now seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The very foundation of the house groaned, as if it were alive, as if it were feeding off the terror that had filled it. The priest fell to his knees, exhausted, his voice failing him. The last of the group, the one who had been closest to him, was dragged toward the attic. It was then that the priest felt it, an overwhelming sense of defeat. There was nothing left to do. The darkness had won. When the authorities arrived, they found the priest barely alive, his body battered and bruised, his hand still clutching his cross. But the group was gone. There was no trace of them, no sign of where they had gone or what had happened to them. The house was still standing, its dark presence hanging heavy in the air. The whispers, though, had stopped. The house was silent now, as if it had finally gotten what it wanted. All that remained was a faint whisper that seemed to echo through the house. The sound so soft it could barely be heard. It was as if the voices were still there, lingering, watching. And as the authorities stepped inside, they couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, that something had changed, that the darkness inside had only grown stronger. The house had won, and the whispers, they were still there, waiting for the next person to come too close, to hear them again, to feel the pull of the house that would never let them go. The farmhouse still stands there, abandoned and decaying. Time has not been kind to it. The roof sags in places, and the walls, once strong, now bow with age, as if the house itself is slowly giving in to the weight of its own dark history. The wind howls through the broken windows, and the overgrown vines crawl up the sides of the house like a living thing, suffocating it further. It stands alone, a silent, crumbling monument to a past that will never be forgotten. People still talk about it, though fewer now, as the years have passed and the stories fade from memory. But even now, the whispers are there. Some say the whispers are nothing more than the wind, playing tricks on the ears of those who dare to venture too close. Others believe they are the voices of the family, the ones who died in the massacre, still trapped in the house, their souls unable to move on. The truth, as always with stories like these, is more complicated than anyone wants to admit. Every time someone dares to enter the house, to step across that threshold, they vanish. Just like that. One moment they're there, the next they're gone. The farmhouse consumes them, pulling them into its dark embrace, and they are never seen again. Sometimes their belongings are found, scattered around the yard or left behind in the rooms. But the people are never found. The whispers grow louder with every new disappearance, and the house grows hungrier, always. As the years have passed, there are fewer and fewer brave enough to venture into Hollow Creek. The stories have spread far and wide, and now most people know better than to go anywhere near that cursed farmhouse. But for those who don't know, or who think the stories are nothing more than myths, the temptation to find out for themselves is still too great. The locals, of course, will tell you to stay away. They'll give you warnings, sometimes in hushed tones, telling you that no one who enters the farmhouse ever comes out. They'll tell you that the place is cursed, that the spirits inside are vengeful, and that the house is alive in a way that no one truly understands. But even with all these warnings, the whispers still call to the curious. It's as if the house itself is luring them in, pulling them. Now, if you ever find yourself in Indiana and you hear whispers on a windy night, know this: it might be the voices of those who never left, the voices of the victims, still trapped in the walls of that cursed farmhouse. Their cries for help never cease. The pain they felt when they were slaughtered in that house, their fear, their desperation, it all lives on in the very structure of the place. It is as if the house absorbed their suffering, and now it echoes in the empty rooms and decaying halls. Some say it's the family, the ones who died, still calling out for someone to free them. But others believe the whispers are something far worse. The house, they say, is not just haunted by the dead. It is haunted by the evil that did this to them in the first place. That malevolent force still lingers, still reaches out for anyone who dares to enter. No matter how many years go by, the whispers will always be there, waiting. And those who hear them, those who dare to listen, will always find themselves drawn to the house. It's like a pull, something primal, something deep in the heart, urging them to step inside. No matter how much they know they should turn away, they can't. It's like the house has a hold on them, one that they can never escape. Some people, after hearing the whispers, claim they feel like they've lost control, like something inside them is guiding them toward the house, even if they know better. And once they step through that door, once they cross that threshold, they are never seen again. But the house doesn't just take people. It leaves something behind. A mark, a stain, a curse that follows them even after they've gone. The ones who escape, if they are lucky enough to escape, are never quite the same. They are haunted by nightmares, by the sound of whispers that follow them wherever they go. Some say it's the house's way of claiming them even after they've left. Others say it's the spirits inside the house reaching out, trying to pull them back in. No matter what they do, no matter how far they run, they can never escape the pull of the farmhouse.
For those who still live in the area, the house is a constant reminder, a shadow that looms over their lives. They avoid it, keep their distance, but they know it's always there. And they know that one day, someone else will be drawn to it. Someone else will hear the whispers, and they will be the next to disappear. And the house will continue, as it always has, feeding off the fear and the curiosity of those who dare to enter. There are those who still believe there is hope, that one day someone will be brave enough to confront the house, to face whatever evil lurks within. But the longer the house stands, the more unlikely that seems. No one has ever truly understood what's inside the farmhouse, what's responsible for the disappearances, the whispers, the evil that never seems to leave. Some say it's a curse that can never be broken. Others say it's the result of some ancient evil that has taken root in the house and will never let go. All anyone knows for sure is that the farmhouse stands alone, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to step inside. ... So, if you're ever passing through Hollow Creek, don't stop. Don't even look at the farmhouse. Don't let the curiosity take hold. Don't listen to the whispers that might drift toward you on the wind. Because if you do, you might just hear them. You might just hear the voices of those who never left. And once you hear them, once you're drawn in, you might never leave either.